Section 1400, I think probably the lesson for this section is small changes can have a major impact. The language in Section 14000, and this is right now I'm not talking about the claims portion, which I'll talk about, or the contract revision portion, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is there's a lot of small and almost, I hate to say subtle because it can have major impact, but in terms of the language itself, you read it initially and it doesn't seem so bad. But when you actually kind of sit and think about it, you realize, well, wait a second, what does this really mean here? Like one example is with regard to what, the scope of the work actually is. It says that you've got to provide all labor and equipment or other incidentals necessary or convenient for successful completion of the project. Well, initially one reads, well, okay, I got to do my work. My scope of work is set out. I'm all in for having a successful project. I think that's great. But the problem is it's basically saying, MnDOT is saying, you're biting off the project. You're not. This isn't just the contract. You are more responsible for more than just what's set forth in your contract. Now, MnDOT does play a little bit of games with the definitions of contract, work, and project. I shouldn't say games. That's probably unfair. But the language itself, when you read through them, I kind of scratched my head and had to read through them a few different times. Those definitions, they didn't change significantly in terms of how they define it. But what's interesting is the contract, it's essentially defined as, and it lists specific items, but it basically says it sets forth the obligations to perform the work. But the definition of work, again, says what is necessary and convenient, but then it also says, and what's in the contract. And project is basically defined the simplest to say, well, it's either the section of the highway or what you're required to do. So by making you responsible for what's in the project, it's not just what's in the contract, it's also what the department deems is necessary or convenient, and I'm not even sure what that means, for the completion of the project. MnDOT has also added some additional language that says, well, the contract itself isn't going to necessarily describe every detail. And if it doesn't, well, then you're required to complete the work in conformance with general practice and the quality specified in the contract. And MnDOT also adds some language, and I honestly don't even know what this means. It says if MnDOT fails to itemize every allowable exception or condition, contract provisions may not be enforced equally under all conditions. I don't even know what that means, but it suggests that MnDOT has a certain level of subjectivity to determine how and when and how much it's going to enforce the contract terms, I guess depending on what's necessary or convenient. Section 1402 is a fairly major change, talking about contract revisions. MnDOT has stated that it's trying to essentially pull redundancies out of the standard specs to put all sort of related provisions in similar sections. And so its contract revisions, basically changes, are set forth now in Section 1402.1 and the next couple of sections. It's even broader than before. MnDOT has taken out the term public interest and now it says department's interest, which I again think adds a certain level of subjectivity, because at least with public interest, MnDOT might argue that they're one and the same, but I would argue that department's interest is probably a little harder for the contractor to argue what is or is not in the department's interest, because MnDOT can say for itself what it thinks it's in its interest. This also says, however, if you disagree, you can make a claim under 1403, or rather assert that a change is under contract revision under 1403. So make sure Section 1403 is followed. A key provision of the 1402 is it says if you don't follow it, your claims are waived. Now this is an unfortunate change in the law, and I think an area where we would suggest that MnDOT is involved in rulemaking, because it attempts to get rid of the argument that, well, if you had actual notice, or if you at least provided timely notice of claims so as not to prejudice MnDOT, you would still be able to assert the claim. MnDOT's going to try to argue that if you don't follow their very precise and exacting requirements, that your claims are going to be waived. 1402.3, MnDOT allows a contract revision, assuming you follow the requirements, if there are significant changes to the character of work. Probably the most significant area in this, or modification in this section, because some of this language was similar to the previous specs, but that what is a material change is now dependent upon how large the contract item is. This only applies to major contract items, and that is defined in the definitions as a contract item equal to or greater than 5% of the original contract amount. So I guess, to avoid the notion of, well, let's just make everything greater than 5% of the original contract, which probably won't be permitted, we would suggest if it's a valid claim, make it anyway, because I don't think it's fair for MnDOT to simply say that we think 5% or anything less than 5% is so de minimis that it's not worthy of a change order or a supplemental agreement. You might be also entitled to a contract revision for extra work, 1402.5. Probably the key red flag to note here is, again, that you waive the claim if you don't give the notice of the claim as required under 1403, but also that MnDOT has the ability to say that if you perform the extra work without the supplemental agreement, it might be considered unauthorized work, and you're performing it at your own expense and your own risk. I'm not going to go in detail through, all of the particulars of the many steps and the time frames of Section 1403.2. We have provided a copy both of the specs and also this PowerPoint. But probably the key thing to keep note here is that you got to get approval from MnDOT from the change. You got to make the change or make the claim and follow the particular requirements. The thing that we noted kind of as a broad picture is, and probably the practice point is to get clarification from the engineer with what you're supposed to do if you notice something that you would think requires a change order, is all of the various requirements of giving notice and waiting for a response from the engineer asking for more information, you're following up with, making a second notice, is that if everything goes according to Hoyle, that provision or that claims period is going to take a minimum of 20 days or maybe 30 if more information is requested. And according to the new specs is you're not supposed to be working on this area during that whole time, because if you are, without a supplemental agreement, you're taking the risk that you might not get paid for it. So it kind of begs the question is, I suppose if it's a small item and maybe you wouldn't need to be working on, but if it's on the critical path, what are you supposed to do? This one is probably the critical point on 1403.3 is the highlighted is not only do you have to provide the written notice after your first verbal notice or oral notice, is you provide this written notice if you disagree, but also if the engineer ignores you altogether. So if the engineer doesn't respond at all, you don't get to wait for the engineer to decide to respond 10, 15, whatever days later, because MnDOT could say, well, you've waived your claim. So the practice point is probably don't even worry about the engineer's response. Just provide the written notice within 5 days, because if for some reason I suppose the engineer agrees with you, well, then you can just say, oh, never mind. 1403.4, the engineer is supposed to provide a written acknowledgement. 1403.5, engineer is supposed to respond within 10 business days of your written response, but although it's got to confirm within that 10 business days, it's either got to confirm it, deny it, or it could ask for more information, which presumably starts the clock all over again. The red flag is, again, make sure you follow those time requirements strictly. Contractor, you've got to make a claim. The contractor has to make a claim under Section 1517, which is the claims provision, which we'll be discussing in just a couple minutes, within 5 business days of receiving the engineer's final written response, or again, if the engineer decides not to respond at all. So practice point, wait, if you wait the 5 days, just make the response assuming you're going to get an answer you don't want to hear. This flow chart, we provided it simply because this is what MnDOT has provided as how it is perceiving the new changes to 1402 or 1403, and then what you're supposed to do depending on MnDOT's response. We're not recommending that this chart be relied upon, but we figured we'd provide it as informational, and perhaps, you know, if one would argue reliance, though I don't necessarily think that that would be something you'd want to do. The reason we have a problem, I think, with this chart is it implies that it's a straight line mechanism, you know, a clear flow chart. But because of the strict requirements of timing, and also some language under 1517, which I'll get to in a minute, which requires mitigation, frankly, it almost requires that you make the claim at the exact same time as you give the notice, because if you wait that 30 days to make the claim, it's going to beg the question on whether MnDOT would argue, well, we haven't had time to mitigate. Now, presumably, asking for the contract revision would allow a MnDOT to take care of that mitigation in the same way, but the language of the specs would suggest that MnDOT would be able to make the argument in strict accordance with the specifications. 1404, I'd say probably the key thing to note is if MnDOT requires it, you get to rely on the contract, but if you request it, you got to pay for it and take care of it. And same with temporary bypasses. 1407, final cleanup. This might not be a major risk problem in practice, but it's some strange language that we requested MnDOT to remove, and it wouldn't do it, which I couldn't understand why. Because this requires that everything's got to be removed before requesting final inspection. So leading to the potential problem of, well, you might have to demobilize and remobilize if anything comes up.